Hello, everybody. We are recording and we will get started with the webinar now. Thank you all for joining us. I'll start with some housekeeping. Please submit any questions you have to the presenter or to myself, the host, via the chat function on the right-hand side of your screen and select all panelists. If you select the host, it will just go to me privately. This is if you're facing any technical difficulties or have any private questions. I will be monitoring the chat function, and we have ample time for Liz to answer questions afterwards. She'll present for about 30 minutes, after which we'll turn to you, and you can submit your questions at any time. We've also opened a poll. And this is something that you can complete after the webinar is complete. So thanks for joining us to discuss part of the new gender equality strategy of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. I should back up for a moment and say that my name is Yasmin bin Humam, and I'm the facilitator of the Women's Financial Inclusion Community of Practice. And today's webinar will be, as I mentioned, on the new strategy of the Gates Foundation. The strategy as a whole covers many areas of programming under the foundation, but what we will be speaking about today falls under the women's economic empowerment portion of the strategy and relates to the work of the Financial Services for the Poor team. And in inviting Liz to present on this topic, our hope was that it would help members of our community see how financial inclusion forms part of the larger objective of women's empowerment, and also to see an example of how a gender-centric financial inclusion strategy can be developed. Some of you may adopt some of the findings and approaches as you undertake similar exercises in your own organizations. Also, naturally, the Gates Foundation is an important donor in financial inclusion, so many of us are keen to see how this will shape the focus of women's financial inclusion programming. So who better to present to us than Elizabeth Callison? Prior to joining the foundation, Liz was involved with various successful online learning portals, and now she is the gender lead for the Financial Services for the Poor team. The FSP team works with a wide range of public and private sector partners to foster the development of digital payment systems, such as mobile money, that can reach hundreds of millions of people with the financial tools they need to mitigate risks and capture opportunities to move out of poverty. Liz leads the team's work to increase low-income women's access to and usage of digital financial services. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Liz.
Well, good morning, everybody. I'm going to talk for a minute to ensure that everybody can hear me. It's really exciting to be bringing to you the new gender equality and women's economic empowerment strategy at the Gates Foundation, and I hope we can have a good discussion today. I'm going to start clicking through the slides. So here's what I'm going to cover today. I will give a sort of brief overview of our new gender equality strategy, what it consists of, and how we developed it, because that process took over a year and was pretty intensive. I'm going to then hone in on the women's economic empowerment components of that strategy, and then finally spend the most time on women's economic empowerment and financial inclusion, what the financial services team is working on around our hypotheses for reducing the gender gap in DFS usage. We will have plenty of time for questions, so feel free to tee them up and send them on to Yasmin. So at the heart of the new gender equality strategy is this vision. And I wanted to share this today because there's some important nuances in it. When we address gender inequality and remove the underlying barriers for women and girls, we unlock the potential for all people. and that includes men and boys. And that's a very important component to us. This is not just about serving low-income women and girls. It's about including men and boys as well in whatever work we're doing so that we can change the underlying barriers and allow everyone to be equally valued and to lead healthy and productive lives. And when this strategy was passed in November of 2017, it was passed by both Melinda and Bill Gates. They also signed off on this important vision and are in it with us. So let's talk, I want to give a little spiel about the Gender Equality Team's purpose, just so you can understand the context in which the financial services team is operating. The Gender Equality Team is working hard to progress the Foundation's goals by working together with program teams to advance gender equality and empower women and girls. And the financial services team is lucky to be one of the first teams that the Gender Equality Team worked with when it started 2 years ago. And there's three main buckets of work that the GE team has in its remit. First is amplifying the impact of what the other teams in the Foundation are doing and targeting specific gender gaps. This is where our women's economic empowerment work falls in. They are also doing a lot of work to build the gender equality field, strengthening data and evidence, driving accountability and impact through global institutions and governments, and offering the Foundation's voice and technical expertise as a global resource. And finally, they have a body of work under driving innovation and learning, and I'll show you a little bit about what is in each of those buckets. And here are the buckets. Under Amplify Impact, you can see that's where the Women's Economic Empowerment Strategy lives. There are 4 levers to it, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And importantly, it also contains the work that the GE team is doing in gender mainstreaming. And you can see the 4, gosh, we have acronyms on this slide, which I'm going to read out. They are working to gender mainstream with 4 teams: the Water Sanitation team, the Financial Services for the Poor team, the Agricultural Development team, and the Family Planning team. And what that has consisted of, the Financial Services team was lucky enough to be the first team that went through this in 2017. And it consisted of 3 sessions with the Gender Equality team and the FSP team as a whole. And we really studied what it meant to us to add an intentional gender lens to all of our work, not just the work that we're doing to reduce the gender gap, in the hopes that if everybody across our team is ensuring that the work they're doing is also addressing the needs of poor women and girls, that together we will all help reduce the gender gap in the use of digital financial services. It was a very important year for the team, I will say, and I know I've spoken with many of you about it. I wouldn't say now that the FSP team is doing a perfect job in applying a gender lens, but I will say that we all now have the same vocabulary. Everybody across the team, and not just this gender lead, can sit down with their investments and think about how they're really going to be transformative for women. And so we've been concentrating on a few big investments that we're making, and we're pretty excited about the future of that work. In the second column under Build the Gender Equality Field, the Foundation is making investments in data and evidence. You might have heard, I believe Melinda announced it last spring, that we are working on gender data and reducing gender data gaps across the world. We also have quite a bit of work going on in communications, movements and campaigns, SDG accountability, and donor engagement. We engage with donors around the world on building the field as well. Lastly, in the third column under Drive Innovation and Learning, probably many of you are familiar with the Grand Challenge that was launched in 2015, and I'm guessing that we have a few of those project folks on the phone with us today. There are 10 teams across the foundation that have grantees in the Women and Girls Grand Challenge. And so we're pretty excited about that work, which is almost 3 years in now. There's also quite a bit of work going on in our health teams on youth and healthy transitions. There's a learning agenda as we figure out how youth can make healthy transitions between different parts of their lives. Okay, I'm trying to advance a slide. Let's try that again. There it is. So when we got started, it was a year and a half ago on developing the gender equality strategy. We asked ourselves a number of very important questions. What if women had the same access to economic assets as men? What if women and girls had the same opportunity to build social networks and thrive? And lastly, what if the world's poorest women and girls could be fully included in markets and economic activity? And those are the kinds of questions that really drove the development of this strategy last year. We did a pretty deep and intensive study of elements that had very strong links to women's economic empowerment. And I will let you read those 13 elements here. And I am going to share the slides afterwards, so don't worry if this slide goes by too quickly. We did a pretty intensive correlative analysis where we studied the effects and the impact of each of these levers on women's economic empowerment to see which were the strongest levers. And 7 of the elements had of the highest scores in that correlation: alleviation of unpaid care work, decent work opportunities, financial inclusion, property and assets, and then the fundamental enablers: education, family planning, and delayed marriage. And many of you may have seen, we asked for a lot of feedback on our framework around these. And we had some hypotheses around the way in which women and girls and countries kind of move through some of the key steps in women's economic empowerment. And one important thing we learned as we did a bunch of case studies, which I think I'm also able to send out at some point, and it showed case studies on countries that had improved gender equality and women's economic empowerment. And it showed that while in most cases many of these elements were present, countries didn't move through towards better empowerment for women in the same pathway. So the pathway itself was rather hard to pin down, but what was critical was that these elements were present. And we landed on 4 that you can see in the gray box. We landed on 4 because one of the things that Melinda Gates felt very strongly about was that we embed the economic empowerment work in the work of existing teams and things that the foundation was already doing or had developed some expertise in. And those 4 were decent work opportunities, financial inclusion, property and assets, and self-help groups as a cross-cutting topic. And self-help groups also includes savings groups. So you can see on the right, this was the beginning of the formulation of our women's economic empowerment strategy, where we were going to work towards access to income and assets, control and benefit from economic gains, and the power to make decisions. And here's our vision: that when women have access to income and assets, and control and benefit from economic gains, and the power to make decisions, and foundational health, which the foundation has already been working on, we get healthy, empowered economic actors of low-income women. resulting in increased equality, reduced poverty, and important intergenerational effects passed on to youth. So here, I wanted to talk a little bit about the 4 levers. You can see on the far left those global elements that I talked about, and then here's the 4 levers that the foundation is going to pull in the second column. We have a body of work in women's digital financial inclusion, which is what we're going to talk about today. There is also a body of work on women's market inclusion that's focused on smallholder farmers and is being led by our Ag Dev team. In women's land tenure security, we have a research portfolio that mainly consists of a grant with an organization called Landesa, and that is also being led by our Ag Dev team. Finally, the gender equality team is doing work in self-help groups as a platform both to onboard women and deliver more services and information to them. And that work really consists of 2 main things. One is a body of work in India on self-help groups to help the Indian government build upon a pretty successful SHG model that they have been rolling out for a number of years. And we're going to help them build sort of model number 2 and really take that SHG model to new heights, hopefully. That's the body of work that's happening in India. In Africa, we're working with a number of players to think through how could we scale successful and quality savings groups, a model that has been working very well, but at the moment is rather expensive and is driven less by governments than it's being driven by nonprofits and NGOs. How can we get governments involved to really understand the power of savings groups and go to scale at quality? And that's going to be a really important body of work in Africa, led by the gender equality team again. But let's focus in on women's digital financial inclusion. You will see on the right that we have a number of outcomes that we are going for. And this is across, the entire list of outcomes is across those 4 levers. But I've put in bold here the ones that our work in women's digital financial inclusion is going to focus on. Diversity of labor opportunity, directing social protection payments into women's accounts, increasing household resource control by women, and increasing account ownership, right? That's a mobile money or a bank account. Increasing account ownership by women. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this slide. We have chosen to work in G2P social protection payments, and I wanted to share why. Last year, when we were developing this strategy, and some of you may have heard me say over the last several years, because I've said it in almost every public forum I've been in, that the gender gap in use of digital financial services is not reducing. It's remaining steady, and we saw that with the release of the 2017 Global Findex in the last month and a half, that while women are making gains, they're not making gains relative to men. And one of the things that I've been focusing on is what's our lever that where we can accelerate women's usage? First, getting into accounts. Second, understanding how to use the account. And 3, going deeper into the use of DFS. And the World Bank shared with us last June the case of 5 countries, Mongolia, South Africa, Brazil, Mexico, and Iran, the countries which digitized their G2P payments and greatly reduced or eliminated the gender gap in account ownership. So let me repeat those countries because there are 5 pretty disparate countries: Iran, Mongolia, South Africa, Brazil, and Mexico. And pretty quickly, those governments, by digitizing those payments and bringing more women into account ownership, they pretty quickly established a digital payment connection with their citizenry. And while there were still some residual effects of women not understanding how to use the accounts and underutilizing those accounts, it really was a pretty big move by the governments that, and in our work, as you know, really some of the biggest moves that can be made to poor people are driven by governments. And so we started on the financial services team, we started thinking, well, that's interesting. I wonder if we wanted to accelerate financial inclusion, how many women in our focus countries don't have accounts but do receive a cash transfer from the government? And we went and did a quick back of the envelope, and these numbers are, I would say, rough, but we did a quick back of the envelope calculation on this. How many women don't have accounts but receive cash transfers in our focus countries? And our focus countries, as a reminder, we have 4 in Africa, 4 in Asia. In Africa, it's Nigeria, Uganda, Tanzania, Kenya. In Asia, it's India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Indonesia. And we came up with a number of about 63 million women that receive GDP cash transfers but don't have an account. And women who are receiving other social safety net transfers but don't have an account was about 76 million. And then in that last row there, actually there's a typo on here, it should just say digitized government wages, not GDP wages. Government wages received by women who don't have accounts, right, they're receiving payments in cash, was about 47 million. And we thought to ourselves, wow, this is a pretty big opportunity for us to help these women get accounts. That could be our accelerant. And there were a few other bits of research we did as well about ways in which to expand inclusion. And we decided to focus on the near term, on the one on the left. And so that's what I'm going to be talking about today. So here is our hypothesis, which I've probably said most of so far. The problem, as you can see, is that if we don't reach women more, we won't be able to reach our overall goal. That by 2035, 80% of adults worldwide and 60% of the sub-$2 a day adults actively use a digital account to access at least one financial service beyond payments. We believe that's the best way for people to start to pull themselves out of poverty. And the evidence that we used for what we're doing is, again, the case of those 5 countries that really made a big impression upon us. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what solution we're putting in place. And now that I look at this slide, solution's a pretty strong word. We're of course hoping to solve this problem, but we are very aware of the fact that gender inequality, and especially gender inequality in financial services, is a really difficult problem. And so I might reterm this the hypotheses we're going to test out. So we're going to test something called digitize, direct, and design, and I'll share what that is in a moment, which are our principles around, we believe that if you digitize priority social protection programs, you direct the money into women's accounts, and you design the program in a gender-intentional way, and she understands the benefits of the program accruing to her, and she understands how to use her account, you get the most impact on low-income women. So we're going to test those hypotheses, and the principles are further down in the slideshow, which I'll show today, in 3 geographies to see if we can move that needle. We are also going to create a robust fact base around how Kiko networks are working for women. I think most of us know that cash-in, cash-out networks work sometimes for women and sometimes not so well for women. And there are a lot of hypotheses around why. Is it that women have more problem with mobility? Well, in some countries, yes, and in some countries, no. Is it a problem that most KICO agents are men? Well, in some countries, yes, and in some countries, no. So we are going to really see if we can dig under that problem, first in the 3 geographies that we're going to be working in, which I'll share in a moment, and then a little bit more broadly. And we will be publishing the results of that research. And finally, we're going to be working on a research and learning agenda to generate as comprehensive a body of evidence as we can. What are the mechanisms through which we're starting to see real gains made by women when they have access to and use a digital account? There has been really promising evidence in the last several years that when women understand how to use an account and they have control over it, that really exciting things start to happen. They spend more money in their communities. They, in many cases, and we've seen some really exciting evidence both in India and in Kenya, they start to choose different professional opportunities. They move from more informal labor to more formal labor choices. And those are the kinds of effects that we'd like to, again, dig under a little bit and find out what's going on there. And so that's what we're going to be focusing on in the next couple of years. Let's just dive into a little bit more detail around that. So these are the elements of the strategy in that second column, and I think I've talked about most of them. The only one I haven't talked about is C of A, B, C, and D. We are likely to work further on the payment ecosystem for poor women through the digitization of wages. We've got some early work going on in Bangladesh right now. We were careful, though, we decided not to include a large-scale body of work in digitization of wages because we didn't want to bite off more than we could conceivably chew, so to speak. So we are focusing on the work on G2P payment systems first, seeing what out of digitized direct and design seems to work best for women. And then in 3 years' time, we'll decide where we're going to go next. Are we going to go bigger across more social protection programs? Are we going to dive more deeply into digitization of wages? So stay tuned on that one. So here's where we've decided to work in the near term. We picked 3 countries and 3 programs. In Pakistan, we had already begun some work on helping the government digitize the Benazir Bhutto Income Support Program, which I'm guessing many of you are familiar with. It is a very large social safety net program in Pakistan that's distributed to, it's actually more than 5.4 million women. They're closing in on 6 million women as of this writing. And we are really hoping to help the government craft a deeper strategy for poor women through this program. In India, in the state of Bihar, we're going to be working on the MGN Regs program. They are very interested in working with us to both digitize the transfer to women and reducing leakage and corruption along the way, and trying to get more women working both in the program and in the community. And so we're pretty excited about that body of work. In Tanzania, we are working with TASF on the Productive Social Safety Net, which is currently in design, PSSN 2. PSSN 1 closed last year. And we had already also started a body of work there in digitization, and we're just adding on some additional layers in that digitized direct and design framework, which I'll share more about in a minute. And I think we wanted to sort of start small in terms of working on just 3 programs and thinking about the lessons we can learn from these 3, across these 3. And I'll share a story about how we picked these 3 last fall. I was pretty excited. I helped drive the strategy, and I thought, well, this is great. We're going to get 3 really interesting exemplars. And now as we've begun rolling it out, I realized, and I realized this in the fall, but now I think I'm deeply realizing this, that these are 3 very different countries and very different programs. And part of my job is to help us make some generalizable conclusions out of the work that we're doing in these 3 countries. And I was at the World Bank sharing this vision with them in March, and one of them sort of put her arm around me and said, "You've chosen 3 really different countries, haven't you?" And I laughed and said, "Yeah, what was I thinking?" So it's very exciting, but it will also be challenging for us because I know each of you knows deeply that these are 3 very different places. So I'm excited about it. It's a big challenge for us, but we're really hoping to both make a difference and create some generalizable lessons that we can share with the world. So here's our hypothesis. As I said earlier, we believe that these 3 elements are very important: digitizing a payment stream, directing the transfers into women's accounts, and designing the social protection policy such that it helps her. It doesn't harm her. But you know, the devil is really in the details of these 3 things. And we are working, I'm actually going to show you all some draft criteria in each of these areas. And before I move to those, to the slides that show you draft criteria, and I do want to emphasize these are draft. We have a couple of social protection folks that are on our team that have been in this field for a long time and who drew upon World Bank experience and in-country experience to create some of these criteria, but we're still refining them. And I also want to emphasize that what you're about to see on some of these slides, it's not rocket science. It's not something new and incredible that the Gates Foundation has thought up. It's best practice around how to reach women, and it's combining those 3 elements together that we believe is hopefully transformative. And so let me just show you what some of these things are. So in the category of digitize, if I can move the slide forward. Whoops. There we go. I'll let you just look at this for a minute. These are the first 4 areas of digitize. And as you read through this, you can see these are not new things, right? These are, this is sort of a checklist of sorts. Have program designers thought through these things? And again, I will send these slides out, so not to worry if I seem to be going too quickly through them. Here's the second page of digitize. And let me move on to direct. Again, emphasizing access and control for poor women. And lastly, design. Is the policy designed such that she can realize the benefit of the program and understands it? We've all seen evidence of well-intentioned social protection programs where women either don't know what's accruing to them, don't understand what's accruing to them, and we're really going to see if we can make a mark on that. So again, these are draft. I'm hoping we're going to get it a little bit tighter and shorter. And the intention behind this is at some point over the summer, we will turn this into a diagnostic of sorts and take it into each of the countries to say, you know, BISP or TASF or NREGA, how do you match up against these criteria? And I can say truthfully that all 3 programs already have a lot of these elements in place. And we will be working with them on where certain elements aren't in place or aren't working well together in consort with each other, and seeing if we can improve the experience for poor women. So I'm now going to back up to a slide, and it will be my last slide so that we can open for questions. I wanted to show you, this is the slide that keeps me up at night. I just wanted to share what we're actually doing, because I've gotten a lot of requests from partners to talk about how can we work together. And I think what I've realized in the last couple of months is we are doing a lot of work right now. So on the left, you can see sort of the bodies of work that I'm either directly working on or working with. I have 3 or 4 or 5 members of the financial services team leading some of these pieces. We're actually putting in basic building blocks. For example, we just got back a month ago from Pakistan, where we were talking to BISP officials and talking to our intermediary Karandas about how we would work together on this program to get their sort of official sign-off that they were interested in working with us. We did that for Tanzania in January, and now we're working with the TESF group on a gender action plan. We've put together some initial research in cash in, cash out. I'm leading a body of work to really refine those D3 criteria. All of those are basic building blocks that are keeping us running as fast as we can. I probably should even move that green chevron further to the right. We won't even begin executing against this strategy till the fall. So if some of you have wondered, gosh, why haven't I heard from the Gates Foundation, because my organization does so much work in this area, it's not at all because we're ignoring you. It's really that we don't even have the wheels on the bicycle yet. And so we won't be really starting to ride that bike until late in the fall. And I'm happy to, continue to do webinars and reach out and be pretty transparent about where we are in this work. And right now, my transparent confession is that we're working really hard to just put the initial bodies of work into place, which is why I wanted to show you this slide. So with that, I am going to wrap up because I've talked long enough and turn it back over to Yasmin, our host, to ask some questions. And I am happy to answer questions. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Liz. That was a lot of very interesting material. Again, we've received a number of questions so far, and I encourage those of you on the line to send in questions through the chat function, and also to complete the poll, which you will see on the bottom right-hand side of your screen. Just a few thoughts on your presentation, Liz. It's so great that in your vision statement that you begin with, you mentioned that the impacts will be felt by men, boys, by everyone, really. And I think it's important for us not to lose sight of that as we pursue, women's empowerment. And also the fact that you have a gender equality team at the Gates Foundation to support you in this will be crucial, especially in changing your culture, not just having a reliance on one gender lead. And I'm sure many of the people who engage with program managers at Gates currently will see an increased focus on gender from their program leads going forward.
Hopefully.
I'm very excited about these 13 elements and the comprehensive analysis that you did on correlation. So if there are any outputs from that we can share with our community after the webinar, that would be great. As you mentioned, the pathways differ, but the elements are common. So I think it means you can support a range of institutions and a range of programs as you pursue this. I had some more thoughts, but questions are coming in. So I'll just start with the question of what does this intense focus on your 3 example countries mean for other countries and initiatives where Gates has historically funded? And I know that you did have a slide. I've left control of the slides with you so that you can still move back and forth. You had slides about, the broader learning agenda and
Yes.
the impact story. And so if you can touch on, what this means for other countries. And we had an additional question about what Gates Foundation is doing or plans to do in the Latin America region on this.
That's a great question. In fact, I should throw a slide in about that. The women's economic empowerment work that I mentioned and the 3 countries where we're going to test what we're calling the D3 hypotheses, that is not the entirety of the gender work that the financial services team is doing. This is an additional focus we're bringing to our work. So in each of our focus countries, I will say 2 things. One is, in each of our focus countries, the 8 that I mentioned, the 4 in Asia and the 4 in Africa, our country leads are actively thinking through how to work with our intermediaries there and we usually do our work through intermediaries in country. How do we work through our intermediaries in those particular countries to reduce the gender gap? And how do we bring a gender intentional lens to the investments we're making in country? That work has been going on for a couple of years now. It will continue to go on in addition to the, as we're calling it, the WE-FI work, Women's Economic Empowerment Financial Inclusion work. The question about Latin America is a really good one. We have opted not to choose focus countries in Latin America because, frankly, the lens that we applied to our focus countries in 2012 was size of country and level of people living in poverty. And so we really picked kind of the, I would say, 7 or 8 of the toughest countries in the world to work in that had very large populations and had very high rates of poverty. And, I think one of the interesting things about Latin America, we are pulling a lot of lessons from Latin America because Latin America has moved, many of those countries have moved themselves from having very, very high rates of poverty to being more middle income countries. So we are pulling lessons from Latin America. We will be sharing out lessons, but we're not doing a lot of direct investment there now because we're trying to focus in on, actually we're focusing most of our investment across the financial services team on the big 5, India, Indonesia, Pakistan, Nigeria, and I'm missing one, Bangladesh. But in terms of, the last thing I want to say about that though is that in terms of lessons learned from the 3 countries that we're going to be doing this economic empowerment work in, we will be trying to share what we're learning along the way, whether that's tweaking the digitized direct and design, that D3 set of criteria, and publishing it out. We're working with the World Bank on it so that if we really do discover something together with them that's powerful, they can start to use it in their programs as well. So we're really trying to create a global public good in what we're doing, not just trying to move the needle in those 3 countries.
Thanks, Liz. And we clearly have some people deeply steeped in women's financial inclusion amongst our audience. We have a series of questions kind of about the type of work in particular, and perhaps this will be more food for thought for you as you move forward, with, fine-tuning the approaches and really determining what exactly you'll be doing with your partners, but perhaps you already have some ideas about this. So I'll throw out about 3 or 4 points that were mentioned, if you could address them. We have a question about whether the design component of D3 will encompass financial capability and how you will if you will collaborate and build on existing work on financial capability for that work. We have someone who had questions about many women do not own mobile phones. So in your earlier slide, you said the potential based on the number of women who are receiving cash payments from the government now. And I know with the new Findex data, we have new data on number of women who own mobile phones. So, how are you incorporating that stumbling block into your work program? We also had questions then again around high banking fees traditionally, and how you plan to solve that. And finally, kind of the sensitive and context-specific issues around household decision-making, right? And so all of these components will likely feature into your program design. Perhaps you already have ideas for how to do it. Those slides on, social protection and the diagnostic tool that you'll be developing, I think, speak a little bit to these questions, but perhaps you can give some more details.
Those are great questions. First, on the financial capability. So this one's going to take me a minute to answer. One of the things that we're doing, there's been early evidence that training women or giving them some kind of product information session has promising results in her ability to access and use her account. We've done some preliminary research on evidence that's out there around financial capabilities and training around that. And what we quickly learned is that the field of evidence is pretty fractured. And there hasn't been, I sort of was naively hoping that there'd be a very easy way to answer the question of what kind of training is needed for women to achieve the vision that we have. And the answer is that there is no easy answer. So we will be doing a body of work. That was one of the bodies of work on the slide that I showed you around what we're doing right now. We will be doing a body of work to intensively study that for about 4 months and have some partners make recommendations to us. Because as you can imagine, we could draw that. I really want to get at the question of learning outcomes. What do we need women to know to most actualize the vision for this program? And as you can imagine, that you could draw that circle pretty tightly, saying she just needs to know how to use an account. Or you can start drawing that circle pretty wide, like you could go into household dialogues for families. Different choices along that continuum cost different things and achieve different kinds of outcomes. And we need to sort of look at all those elements to think about what we would test and recommend to some of these governments who in many cases already have some training in mind for beneficiaries in these programs. But we need to develop a perspective on that. And quite frankly, we don't have one yet. And when we do have one, I will be sharing it and talking about what we're going to test out. But so that's a great question. That is something we need to really wrestle to the ground for ourselves in the next 4 or 5 months to develop that perspective. The second question around mobile phone. So that is indeed a barrier, a continued barrier for many women around the world. And that's why one of the elements we are going to build into Digitize and Design is that the programs can't be completely mobile phone centric for women. There need to be options for the way that women reach their digital accounts and are able to work those digital accounts. And so, again, some of the programs have already been wrestling with this topic, BISP in Pakistan being one of them. They've tried out some things that haven't worked particularly well, and so they're going to change it up. The particular example I'm thinking of in Pakistan was giving women ATM cards to there's some 12,000 ATMs in Pakistan that serve millions and millions and millions of people. And so, first of all, it would only serve women in a urban area. And then second of all, women didn't feel comfortable going out of their homes and using the ATM cards in machines, so they had cases of where male villagers would gather up all the BISP recipients' ATM cards, take them all to the ATM, and then women wouldn't receive all the money that they were entitled to. So there's a lot of issues that need to be thought through about how women are going to access these accounts. But the biggest one that we've been left with as we've developed this is that the sets of programs that we help design can't be completely reliant solely on mobile phones. The third question around high banking fees. So I would just bring us back to what the financial services team has been talking about for, now 6 years. It's been 6 years this month since our new digital strategy was launched. And that is that we must work towards low-cost, accessible financial services for poor people. And we're doing that as a team in those 8 focus countries in a number of ways. One, we're working with governments to put the infrastructure and ecosystem in place to be able to offer financial services in low-cost ways. In some countries, the private sector has, I won't say readily adopted, but I will say been open to that. In some countries, the private sector and banks have not been as open to that. And we're trying to help convince them that, boy, there's a big market in your country of a lot of poor people who may be making transactions in very small amounts. But if they make frequent enough transactions, and we've done the math, I don't know if anybody who's listening has read our report that we did, and it was either 2013 or 2014, on fighting poverty profitably. But we did the math on if you have enough transactions going through the system, then you don't have to charge high fees, which of course, if you lower your fees, it encourages more people to use your services. And so we believe very strongly in bringing down those high banking fees. And actually I've done a lot of work on that. Again, that paper is called Fighting Poverty Profitably. The last question, Yasmin, that you threw out was around household decision making, how we put that, how is that going to express itself in the program? That is also a very good question. One of the things in our research and learning agenda is, I think I mentioned, we're going to be looking into what's the mechanism by which women are more empowered. And we believe increased household decision making, control over resources will show that women are more empowered in their household. So we may not be working directly on household decision making, but we believe that if you set up the right elements in women's lives, right, if she's receiving money into her account and she has the ability to access and use that money in her life, we believe there's a correlation to improved household decision making. But we're going to have to test that hypothesis and see if that's true.
Thanks. We're coming up on time, but I plan on going a bit over time, given how many questions are coming in, and just given your detailed and involved and insightful answers, Liz, here. But I am trying to kind of group the questions together at this point, and I'll throw a few of them to you at once. So you touched upon this just now. We had a question about the multi-year targeted research agenda that you have. And so, we've just talked about some of the questions that you'll need to consider and that you'll need to look into as you go through this programming. But maybe you can speak a little bit more about, how you will define this research agenda and set the parameters for it, and what kinds of things it might support. And coupled with that was another question on, how are you going to track unintended consequences, you know, of the programming that's pursued. The specific example was, you know, financial empowerment upsetting power dynamics in the household, and you've just spoken to your hypothesis around that. But hopefully your programming can build in some, you know, impact analysis, which I think you said you were going to do. And then we had some questions around kind of related areas, and how will these advocacy efforts around financial inclusion tie in with the Foundation's global health strategy, given that addressing health barriers is directly linked to mobility and advancement and a lot of the outcomes that you've identified for financial services. And also another issue which is very critical in Africa in particular is land and property rights. And how high does the Foundation rate that compared with other barriers that women face?
Gosh, these are all great questions. Okay, first, the multi-year targeted research agenda, how we will define it. So I want to be transparent in saying that we have not yet begun to define it. If you will see my, when I send the slides out, you will see again those bodies of work. And we've deliberately pushed off defining the research agenda to at a minimum this fall because we're getting these basic building blocks in place. But, you know, I think there are some seminal questions that we will be starting out with. And one of them is the mechanism through which women are empowered. As I've said in some of this evidence base that's been coming out over the last couple of years, there's been some really exciting, findings that, for example, the Surrey Jack study in Kenya found that 186,000 households came out of, and women-headed households came out of poverty in the 7 years of the study, right? And this was correlated with how accessible mobile money was in Kenya. And so one of the ways that the researchers surmised they were coming out of poverty is this sort of
I think Liz has just dropped off the line momentarily. Just a moment, everyone, while I try to work out this technical kink. All right, Liz, can you please try and say something once again? Thanks for your patience, everyone. Liz, perhaps you want to quickly log out and then log back in again. Hopefully that will solve the problem. So, thanks everyone for your patience. Hopefully we can get this resolved within the next 2 minutes. Otherwise, do rest assured that I am keeping track of all the questions coming in, all the questions, all the information being submitted in the poll regarding what more you would like to learn about. So this conversation will definitely continue. And for those of you with a bit of patience, let's see if we can get Liz back on the line. All right, everyone. I think it might be a bit challenging to get Liz back online, but I think she put on a good show and a valiant effort, and I know that she can hear me speaking right now. Liz, if there's something that you'd like me to say in closing to the attendees, just send it through the chat message and I'll mention it. Many of you are already members of our Women's Financial Inclusion Community of Practice. For those of you who aren't, I would encourage you to join us. We host a number of webinars such as this one. Our next webinar will be June 12th. And it will be entitled Female Smallholder Farmers in the Financial Inclusion Agenda. The recent CGAP publication, Female Smallholder Farmers in the Financial Inclusion Agenda, highlights the gender gap in financial inclusion among smallholder families in Tanzania and Mozambique through unique survey data that are representative of smallholders at the national level. And using a gender lens in the analysis of smallholder financial behavior reveals that rural expansion of financial institutions has not automatically reached female smallholders. This webinar is an opportunity to dive deeper into the key findings and discuss with practitioners how these insights can shape design and delivery of products that address the challenges faced by female smallholder farmers. So I hope you can all join me for that. And thanks very much to Liz for this webinar. We'll make the recording available and perhaps we'll schedule a follow-up webinar for all the remaining questions. Thank you everyone for joining.